My name is Margaret Hayes, and tonight I stand behind the counter of the bakery I've kept alive for 40 years, smoothing a line of flour with the back of my hand the way other people pet a dog to keep from crying. The ovens hum low, the glass cases shine, and the street outside smells like rain. I should be closing the register, but my hands tremble in that tight, controlled way that happens when anger won't give you the release of tears. I am not a woman who falls apart. I am the woman who kneads dough until it submits, who remembers the names of church ladies and the birthdays of their grandchildren, who paid every bill on time even after my husband forgot to mail checks. I am the owner here, the one whose name sits on the lease, the one who opened at 4 a.m., all those winters when our son was little and money thin as paper. Tonight I know what I wasn't meant to know. A lipstick color I don't wear on a coffee cup in my husband's truck. A hotel reservation that pinged my phone because the joint credit card is still joint, no matter what stories Richard tells in whispers. And the worst part, the part that sticks like ash in the throat, is that the woman in those elevator reflections beside him is my daughter-in-law, Laura, the girl I helped pick centerpieces with. The girl I handed my mother's rolling pin to, the one I told, "This family keeps its promises." I want to be the kind of fool who stays fooled. It would hurt less. But I have always been Margaret who counts inventory. So I open my black notebook, and I do what I do best. I make a plan, and I will not stop until the truth rises, like bread that refuses to stay flat. The rain came down soft and steady in Charleston, tapping the awning, sliding along the window panes of the bakery like it had a schedule to keep. I turned the sign to closed and listened to the bell settle. Habit made me check tomorrow's pre-orders. 12 pies for the Historical Society fundraiser, 3 dozen cinnamon rolls for the church breakfast, a retirement cake for the librarian who watched our son do homework at her back table long before he became a firefighter. The rhythm of it kept me breathing even as that lipstick image kept pulsing in the corners of my vision. I wasn't looking for trouble when I found the receipt. Richard had left the truck keys on the hallway table, and the manual release lever for the garage door had stuck again. I went out to jiggle it loose, moving the glove compartment junk so I could reach the latch. The slip of paper fluttered free, their hotel's name, the room level printed in neat numbers, a date that wasn't business travel and a time that made my stomach burn. The words weren't dramatic. They didn't need to be. They were arithmetic, an equation that already had only one answer. I drove to the waterfront where the air moved and the sky opened wider, and I let the truth take the shape of sentences I could say without breaking. Richard is cheating with Laura. The knowledge didn't arrive with screaming. It arrived with a stiffening, like the body knows a blow is coming and decides to become a wall. I stared at the ironwork balconies and the slow, honest boats, and I measured the life I had built against the life they meant to steal. By the time the rain paused, I'd already called a private investigator recommended by Ms. Caldwell, a friend from the Rotary Club who handled small business contracts. I left a message that was not a confession, only a request for a price quote and a schedule. When I hung up, I could feel my pulse climb back down from my throat to where it belonged. I started the car and drove home. The house smelled like rosemary and laundry soap. I set the receipt under a magnet on the side of the fridge, where only I stash things to deal with later. Then I sat at the kitchen table and practiced my face in the reflection of the dark window. Courteous, steady, not blind. I knew the difference between being decent and being naive, and for once I would not confuse them. 2 days later, the investigator met me in a coffee shop I never use, the kind with reclaimed wood and a poet's open mic sign. She introduced herself as Hattie McClure, and she looked like someone who had quietly seen more than she ever says. She placed a small folder on the table, closed, and an even smaller recorder next to it, also closed. We didn't touch either. We talked first. I told her what I suspected and why, what I needed and what I refused to do. I said, "No one is to be followed into private spaces. No trespassing. I want what can stand up in sunlight." She nodded once, wrote nothing down, and asked 2 questions I had been avoiding. "Do you want your son to know now? Do you want to keep the bakery?" The folder was spare, but sufficient when I finally opened it. Photographs of 2 figures walking too close in a hotel lobby, a slip of paper with a date that matched the receipt, an email printout from a joint account Richard had connected to his phone, but forgotten I still could view. There were no bedroom shots, no grainy scenes a jury would blush at. Hattie had warned me, people think they need the worst picture to know what's true. They don't. She was right. I saw my son's wife looking at my husband like a thief sizing the lock, and I understood the lock was me. That night, Ethan worked a late shift. Richard claimed he had paperwork at the contractor's office. I made pot roast and set 2 plates, then ate alone at the kitchen counter with the news murmuring about road closures. After the dishes, I took out the bakery ledgers and studied the pattern of the last 6 months. There, tucked into the numbers like a weed curling through a fence, were the purchases Richard had made without asking, consultations with a franchise firm, a retainer to a designer I'd never met, an LLC filing under his name, and, God help me, Laura's. The plan was not just to replace me in my marriage, it was to remove me from my life's work. The anger that rose then wasn't heat, it was structure. It arrived like scaffolding, upright and useful. I called Mr. Caldwell and asked for an appointment. "Bring what you have," she said. "And Margaret, bring someone you trust to sit in the waiting room. It helps." I didn't have anyone to bring, so I decided to bring myself and my stubbornness. It would have to be enough. Ms. Caldwell's office occupied a 2nd-floor suite above a hardware store, the kind with a front desk bell and rows of gleaming hinges. She wore navy and sensible shoes and a face that softened exactly once when she asked about my son. We spread the papers across her conference table. She listened the way a good baker watches dough, efficient, with the patience to wait for what needs to rise. When I finished, she tapped a pen against the retainer agreement and said, "We'll protect the business first, then we'll deal with the rest." We filed an injunction to freeze any transfer of bakery assets pending further review. She drafted a letter to Richard stating that all contracts, leases, and vendor agreements were to be routed through me, the sole owner of record. She had me change passwords, call the accountant, and schedule a full inventory. Every task felt like tightening a bolt on a structure I had let sway for too long. The legal work steadied me, but the ache remained. At night, I could smell the ghost of hotel soap through the house, even when the air was clean. When Ethan showed up after shift, boots in hand, we ate grilled cheese at the kitchen island like we used to when he was 10. He joked about a cat they pulled from a tree and how the cat scratched the youngest firefighter and then perched on Ethan's shoulder like a pirate's parrot. He looked happy and tired, and I wanted to keep him safe from what I knew. But safety and truth had finally parted ways, and I had chosen. I invited Richard and Laura to a Friday family dinner, the first one in weeks. I told them I'd be discussing estate planning now that my hands ached more on damp mornings. Richard agreed too quickly. Laura brought a lemon tart from a boutique bakery across town, which I accepted with the same smile I keep for customers who pay late and apologize loudly. I set the table with my mother's china and polished the flatware until I could see myself, crisp and small, reflected in the knives. I called Ms. Caldwell and asked her to join us after the soup course. "It's not an ambush," I said. "It's a conversation with facts," she replied. "Then let the facts speak." The kitchen filled with the smell of garlic and butter. I ladled tomato soup and set out grilled sourdough with melted provolone, comfort food that forgives awkward silences. Ethan came straight from the station in a clean polo, his hair still damp from a quick shower. Richard arrived in a sport coat he reserves for funerals and attempts at charm. Laura wore a dress the color of money. The conversation stayed in safe lanes: work, weather, weekend plans, until I brought out the legal pad with the neat stack of documents beneath it. "Before dessert," I said, "I want to talk about the bakery and the future." My voice sounded like it belonged to a woman making a presentation to the city council, not to a wife asking for kindness. I slid the top document forward, my ownership papers, signed and filed. Richard's eyes flickered to Laura's, then back to me. Laura sipped water like it was a script cue. I didn't accuse. I documented. I laid out the timeline of expenses I had found, the franchise consultant invoices, the LLC filing with their 2 names. I said the words conflict of interest and community property and breach of fiduciary duty without flinching. When Laura started to protest that I'd misunderstood intentions, "Ms." Caldwell rang the doorbell on time like she had a stopwatch for justice. I let her in, and we all sat back down as if in a courtroom arranged around my dining table. Caldwell asked questions, her tone professional, not cruel. Why was an LLC formed without the founder's consent? Why were bakery recipes included in a prospectus? Why did a hotel receipt align with a meeting with a vendor Richard had never told me about? The answers tumbled, tangled, and then stopped. Richard's face tried on a dozen expressions, none that fit. Ethan sat still. There was a moment when a child, no matter how grown, recognizes that a parent is not who he believed. I saw that moment pass through my son like a shadow. He didn't look at Laura. He looked at me, and I held his gaze because I had promised myself I would never look away again. We didn't shout. That surprised me. We rehearsed the facts once more, then Ms. Caldwell outlined next steps. Laura gathered her purse and the tart and left early, saying she had a headache. Richard stayed, staring at his hands, until Ethan stood, thanked me for dinner, and said he'd be at the station for a double shift. After the door closed, the house released a long breath, and something in me relaxed, not relief, not victory, just the end of pretending. Charleston wakes early, and so do rumors. The next morning, 2 regulars came in together in a rush of perfume and curiosity, and I gave them both the same smile I give to everyone who buys cookies for comfort. By noon, I had met with Caldwell again and filed the paperwork to initiate divorce proceedings. She promised to move quickly to keep the business insulated. I went back to the bakery and did the simplest, most defiant thing I could do. I made bread until the counter gleamed with loaves that crackled when you touched them. Late afternoon, the oven alarm started chirping a high, wrong note. One of the vents seized, tripping the smoke sensor in a fussy cascade that any kitchen suffers once in a while. I killed the heat and propped the back door, but the alarm had already notified the system. Minutes later, a fire engine rolled up, lights washing the storefront with a pulse of red and white. The bell above the door rang like a hand clapping fast. 2 firefighters trotted in, cheerful and efficient, and then Ethan stepped through behind them, eyes widening when he saw me. "We're fine," I called, embarrassed but calm. Faulty vent. I overcompensated, like I do. The younger firefighter laughed and checked the panel. Ethan checked the hood, the wiring, the corners where grease gets bold. Richard, as if summoned by the noise and seeing a stage he couldn't resist, strode in with Laura at his shoulder. She had the nerve to wear sunglasses indoors. The room went quiet long enough to hear the oven tick as it cooled. No one planned the tableau, but there it was, my son in uniform, doing his job, my husband and my daughter-in-law side by side, doing theirs. A neighbor who had followed the truck in took out her phone. I didn't snatch it away. I let truth collect its witnesses. Ethan finished the check, gave me a professional nod, and told dispatch we were clear. Laura muttered something about bad timing, and Richard tried to make a joke the room wouldn't accept. I felt like a bell someone had struck clean. The sound went through me and out into the street. When the trucks pulled away and the last customer drifted out with a story to tell, I locked the door and leaned on the counter. I wasn't shaking. I was awake. Fully. Finally. The town would talk. Let it. I had spent years keeping the peace by keeping quiet. Now I would protect the truth the way I protect a recipe. I would keep it intact, and I would serve it warm. Courtrooms are colder than you think. All that marble pretending to be neutral. Caldwell sat beside me with her files stacked like small fortresses. Richard's attorney, a man with a tie the exact red of a bruise, argued that the LLC was exploratory, that nothing had been taken yet, that I was overreacting out of jealousy. Caldwell didn't smile. She showed the judge our vendor contracts, our payroll, our tax returns, and the franchise prospectus with my recipes named as Legacy IP. She brought out the timeline and the hotel receipts and the emails where Laura asked a designer whether my logo could be freshened without changing it enough to count as theft. She didn't ask the judge to be angry. She asked the judge to read. The decision on interim orders came quickly. The bakery remained under my sole control. Richard was barred from accessing accounts. All business-related communications would be copied to Caldwell's office. The court would set a date to finalize dissolution. It wasn't triumph music. It was paperwork, the kind that keeps roofs from leaking. Still, my hands loosened their quiet fist. What I didn't expect, because life does not run on our timetables, was how fast Laura ran when the spotlight swung toward her. She stopped answering Richard's calls. Then a witness list for another case, a civil suit involving that franchise firm, arrived with her name tucked among consultants. Caldwell arched an eyebrow and said, "It appears duplicity has never been a limited resource." The judge didn't need Laura to be present to see what had happened. The numbers told their story without anyone crying on the stand. When we walked out into the bright strip of afternoon, the air felt warmer than it should have. Ethan was waiting by the bench beneath the live oak. He looked at me like a man who had walked through smoke and found a room still intact. "You did good, Mom," he said, and his voice had the brief crack he tries to hide when he talks about hard rescues. I told him I was sorry that the truth hurt. He said, "It hurt more when it was a rumor." We stood there in our little square of shade, two people who had just watched a house of cards fall without needing to blow. That evening, after I locked the shop, I walked the long block to the pier where pelicans float like old men in Sunday hats. I called my sister up in Ohio, someone I hadn't leaned on in years because pride is a lonely habit. We didn't speak about betrayal for long. We spoke about recipes, about our mother's hands, about how a woman tells herself the truth and then repeats it until it outweighs the lies. When I hung up, a couple I recognized from the neighborhood waved. They said the bread helped their grandson eat after a hospital stay. It wasn't victory. It was proof of useful work, and the world nodding back. Healing, it turns out, doesn't have ceremony. It has repetition. I got up the next morning at 4:30 and cracked eggs into a bowl while the city still slept, and the smell of butter told me I was still myself. Business steadied. Regulars brought friends who had never bothered to cross the threshold before, and I made sure the counter never looked empty. Caldwell found me a business coach who had seen other women shepherd companies through storms. She helped me rework the wholesale line, retrain staff, and set a policy. No one but me and the manager could authorize new vendors. A rule is just a fence you know where to find. Ethan moved into the room over the garage for a while, and at night we sat with the windows open and talked about the kind of love that doesn't ask you to shrink. He filed for an annulment. He cried once, quietly, and I pretended to be looking for a misplaced spatula until he finished. I kept the black notebook but turned it into something else. Recipes I wanted to try, the names of people who needed checking in on, lists of small kindnesses I owed the world for holding me when I thought I would break. A month later, I hung a new sign in the front window. Community Class Thursdays. We taught anyone who wanted to learn how to braid challah or frost a sheet cake with hands steady enough to write the name right the first time. Widows brought stories, grandfathers brought grandkids, and women who had been told they were too old to start something brought eyes that glowed like ovens coming to temperature. I showed them how to test proof with the pad of a finger, how to listen to bread. When I said, if it springs back slowly, it's ready. I thought about myself and didn't mind the metaphor. Sometimes Richard passes by across the street and pretends he doesn't see me. I don't wave. Forgiveness is a pie you bake on a day when you can smell apples and cinnamon without thinking of rot. I'm not there yet. I may never be. But I have learned something steadier than forgiveness, the right to my own life. I lock up each night, slide the deadbolt with a sure hand, and turn for home. My son's truck in the driveway is a light left on. The air holds that hint of yeast that says tomorrow is already beginning, and I am the one who will decide what rises. Thank you for watching. If you enjoy these family drama and revenge stories, please subscribe and join me for more every day.